The last time Amara Whitfield saw Julian Ashford, he was climbing into the back of a black car that cost more than her mother's entire house, and he never once looked back. 10 years later, that same car pulled up outside her flower shop, and this time he stepped out shaking. Hello, my beautiful Proudly family. Welcome back to Proudly Black Stories. Your love and support mean the world to us. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from? What time is it in your city right now? If you're new here, subscribe and officially become part of our Proudly family. Now, let's begin today's unforgettable story. Amara Whitfield used to believe love was supposed to feel like sunlight, warm, easy, something you didn't have to fight for. She learned otherwise at 19, standing in a hospital hallway with a positive pregnancy test crushed in her fist and a phone that would not stop ringing straight to voicemail. That was 10 years ago. Now at 29, Amara stood behind the counter of Whitfield & Bloom, the flower shop she'd built from nothing in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, wrapping a bouquet of white peonies for a nervous young man proposing that evening. Her hands moved with practiced grace, but her mind, as it often did in quiet moments, drifted somewhere she didn't want it to go. "You're doing that thing again," said Denise, her best friend and shop manager, leaning against the register with a knowing smirk. "That faraway look, who is it this time? The electric bill or a man who doesn't deserve your thoughts?" Amara laughed, tying a satin ribbon with a little too much force. "Neither. I'm just tired." Denise crossed her arms. "Tired like a woman running a business and raising a genius 9-year-old on 3 hours of sleep, or tired like you saw his name pop up on the news again?" Amara's fingers stilled over the ribbon. She hadn't told Denise about the article, the one that had appeared in her newsfeed 2 nights ago. Ashford Global announces historic expansion into renewable energy, CEO Julian Ashford to lead initiative personally. There had been a photo. He looked older, sharper around the jaw, tired around the eyes in a way that money couldn't fix. She'd closed the app so fast her phone nearly slipped from her hand. "I don't think about him," Amara said, which was of course a lie the size of Charleston Harbor. Denise raised an eyebrow but let it go, for now, because the bell above the shop door chimed, and in walked Amara's entire world in a 9-year-old's body. Her son, Zion, backpack half open, curls bouncing, grinning like he'd just discovered. "Mama! Miss Patterson said I could skip a grade in math." Amara's heart, heavy just seconds before, lifted instantly. "Did she now?" She said, "I'm exceptionally gifted." Zion puffed his chest out. "Her words, not mine. Exceptionally gifted, huh?" Amara knelt down and pulled him into a hug, breathing in the scent of chalk dust and little boy sweat. "Wonder where you get that from." "You," Zion said immediately. "Obviously," Denise snorted from behind the counter. "Obviously." Amara laughed, brushing a curl from Zion's forehead, the same unruly curl pattern she couldn't help but notice that belonged to a man 3,000 miles away in a glass office tower he probably didn't even look up from. Zion had her deep brown skin, her stubborn chin, her love of books, but his eyes, sharp, amber-flecked, unnervingly intelligent, those were Julian's every single day. Amara looked into her son's face and saw the man who had promised her forever, and given her nothing but silence. She pushed the thought down, the way she'd trained herself to for a decade, and stood. "Homework first, then you can help me with the delivery orders." "Can I use the thorn scissors?" "Absolutely not." "One day I'm getting those scissors," Zion muttered, dragging his backpack toward the little reading nook Amara had built in the corner of the shop, surrounded by ferns and second-hand books. It was his spot. Had been since he was old enough to sit up on his own. Denise waited until he was settled before turning back to Amara, voice low. "You gonna tell me what's really going on, or do I have to guess?" Amara sighed, untying her apron strings just to give her hands something to do. "Ashford Global is opening a branch here, in Charleston." Denise's mouth fell open. "Here? Like here? Groundbreaking's in 3 weeks. It was in the paper this morning. Some big revitalization project downtown." Amara's voice was carefully flat, the way she'd learned to speak about Julian Ashford in any context. Flat, distant, safe. Community jobs, green energy, campus, the whole thing. "And is he coming to oversee it?" "I don't know," Amara said, and hated how much the not knowing cost her. "I don't keep up with his schedule, Denise." Denise studied her for a long moment. "Amara, baby, if that man rolls up in this city—" "He won't," Amara cut in, sharper than she meant to. Then softer. "He hasn't been back to Charleston once in 10 years. Why would he start now?" But even as she said it, something cold slid down her spine, the kind of feeling she used to get right before a Category 4 hurricane made landfall. A pressure change in the air. A sense that something enormous was coming, whether she was ready or not. She didn't know yet how right she was. 3,000 miles away, in a corner office on the 42nd floor of Ashford Tower in Manhattan, Julian Ashford stood at the window with a glass of untouched scotch in his hand, staring down at a city that had never once made him feel less alone. Behind him, his executive assistant, Marcus, cleared his throat for the third time. "Sir, the Charleston presentation. The board wants your final sign-off by end of day." "I heard you the first 2 times, Marcus." "Yes, sir. It's just, you've been standing there for 11 minutes. Julian didn't turn around. On the glass in front of him, faintly reflected, he could see the framed photograph on his desk. The only personal item in an office otherwise built entirely of steel, glass, and ambition. It wasn't a photo of his parents, or an award, or anything a stranger would expect to find on a billionaire's desk. It was a single, crumpled photograph of a laughing young woman on a Charleston pier, sunlight caught in her braids, her whole face lit up with a joy he hadn't felt in 10 years. Amara. He'd carried that photograph through 4 apartments, 2 continents, and 1 entire empire built out of guilt and grief. He'd never told anyone what it meant. He'd never told anyone about her at all. "Sir?" Marcus tried again, gentler this time. "Should I tell the board the Charleston project is a go?" Julian finally turned. His reflection in the window had shown him an exhausted man, but the man Marcus saw now had something different in his eyes. Something that looked almost like fear, wrapped inside a decision that had clearly already been made. "Tell them it's a go," Julian said quietly. "And Marcus, I'm going to Charleston personally, for the groundbreaking." Marcus blinked. "Sir, with respect, you haven't set foot in Charleston in 10 years. Your father built that division specifically so you wouldn't have to." "I know what my father did," Julian said, voice tightening. "This time I'm going myself." Marcus hesitated, then nodded, gathering his tablet. At the door he paused. "Is there something in Charleston, sir?" Julian looked back out the window, at the city lights beginning to flicker on beneath a darkening sky, and thought of a hospital hallway 10 years ago that he had walked past, not into, because his father's security team had been standing outside it with strict instructions, and because he had been 22, terrified, and weak in a way he had spent the last decade trying to bury under boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. He thought of the voicemail he never returned, the letter he wrote and never sent. The years of silence that had calcified into something he told himself was necessary, was mercy, was protecting her from a family that would have destroyed her. He thought of the private investigator's file sitting locked in his desk drawer, updated quarterly for the past 9 years, containing every photograph, every school record, every small mercy of information about a boy named Zion Whitfield that Julian had never once had the courage to act on. "Yes," Julian said finally, so quietly Marcus almost didn't hear him. "There's something in Charleston." "Someone," he corrected silently, closing his eyes. "Someone I destroyed. And I don't even know if she'll let me try to fix it." Back in Charleston, the evening light was turning gold over the shop windows as Amara closed up for the night. Zion sat cross-legged on the counter, swinging his legs, recounting, in exhaustive scientific detail, why he believed Pluto deserved to be called a planet again. "And honestly, Mama, it's not fair. Just because it's small doesn't mean it doesn't count. Small things can still be important." Amara paused mid-sweep, something in his words landing harder than he could have known. "That's very true, baby. I'm just saying." Zion hopped off the counter. "Can we get shrimp and grits tonight? Grandma's making it. We'll see." Amara smiled, locking the front door behind them as the last of the evening customers drifted away down the cobblestone street. Neither of them noticed the black town car that had slowed, briefly, at the corner, nor the man inside it who had told his driver on impulse to take the long way past Whitfield and Bloom before heading to the hotel. Julian Ashford sat frozen in the back seat, hand pressed flat against the window, watching a small boy with amber-flecked eyes laugh at something his mother said. His son, who had grown up entirely without him. "Sir," the driver asked, noticing him in the rearview mirror. "Everything all right?" Julian couldn't answer. His throat had closed around 10 years of unsaid apologies, and for the first time since the day he'd climbed into a car and left Amara Whitfield standing on a hospital sidewalk, Julian Ashford felt something crack open inside his chest that he had spent a decade building steel walls around. He watched them walk hand in hand down the street until they turned a corner and disappeared from view. 3 weeks, he thought. I have 3 weeks to figure out how to become a man worthy of walking back into their lives. Or I need to turn this car around right now and never come back. He didn't turn the car around. That, more than anything, would prove to be the decision that changed everything. Later that night, after Zion was asleep and the dishes were done, Amara sat on her back porch with a cup of chamomile tea going cold in her hands, staring at the fireflies blinking lazily over her small garden. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A text from an unknown number. "I know it's been 10 years. I know I don't deserve to reach out like this. But I'm going to be in Charleston soon, and I needed you to hear it from me before you saw it anywhere else. I'm so sorry, Amara, for everything." Jamara's hand trembled so badly the tea sloshed over the rim of her cup. 10 years of silence. 10 years of building a life, a business, a son, entirely without him. And now, 3 words into a text message, her whole careful world was already beginning to shake. She read the message 4 times before she set the phone down, face up on the table between them like it was something dangerous. He's coming here, she thought, heart hammering. He knows about Zion. He has to know. And somewhere deep in the part of her heart she'd spent a decade trying to armor over, a single terrifying question rose up before she could stop it. What if, after everything, some part of me still wants to know why? Amara didn't sleep. She lay awake until the sky outside her bedroom window shifted from black to bruised purple to pale gold, Julian's text still glowing faintly in her mind, even though she'd long since turned her phone face down on the nightstand. 3 sentences. 10 years of silence broken by 3 sentences and a single letter for a signature, as if he still didn't trust himself to write his own name to her. I'm so sorry, Amara. For everything. Sorry didn't raise a child. Sorry didn't sit up through croup at 3 in the morning, or stretch a paycheck to cover ballet shoes and asthma medication in the same week, or explain to a 5-year-old why his father's face never showed up at a single school function, not one, not ever. By the time Zion padded into the kitchen in his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes, Amara had already decided she would not answer the text. She would not think about it. She would go to work, she would run her shop, she would raise her son, and if Julian Ashford wanted to grovel, he could do it to a locked door. It was a good plan. It lasted exactly until 9:15 that morning, when the bell above Whitfield and Bloom rang and Amara looked up to find her mother, Odessa, standing in the doorway with a newspaper folded under her arm and an expression that could crack granite. "Mama!" Amara set down the vase she was arranging. "You're supposed to be at the church with the quilting circle. Quilting circle can wait." Odessa Whitfield was 61 years old, 5'2", and had never once in her life been intimidated by anything or anyone, including, Amara suspected, death itself. She dropped the newspaper on the counter and tapped it once, hard, with a manicured nail. "You want to explain to me why Julian Ashford's face is on the front page of the business section, talking about breaking ground 3 streets from my grandbaby's school?" Amara's stomach dropped. "I saw the article. Did you see the part where they said he's arriving personally to oversee the project?" "Personally, Amara. That man hasn't set foot in this city in 10 years, and now all of a sudden, Odessa stopped herself, closing her eyes, visibly reeling her temper back in. When she opened them again, her voice had softened, but her eyes hadn't. "He texted you, didn't he?" Amara's silence was answer enough. "Lord have mercy." Odessa pressed a hand to her chest and sank onto the stool behind the register. "After 10 years. 10 years, Amara, and that boy thinks he can just walk back into this city and—" "He's not walking into anything," Amara said, though her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. "I'm not going to see him. I don't care what he's building 3 streets over. Zion and I have a life. A good life. We don't need him rearranging it. I know that, baby." Odessa reached over and took her daughter's hand, the way she'd done 1,000 times before. At the hospital 10 years ago, at the shop's grand opening, at every single moment in between when the weight of raising a child alone had threatened to break Amara's back. "I just need you to be ready. Because a man like that, with that much money and that much guilt sitting on his chest for 10 years, he doesn't send one text and disappear. Mark my words, he's going to come looking." Amara wanted to argue. She wanted to insist that Julian Ashford, who had climbed into a car and vanished from her life without so much as a backward glance while she stood outside a hospital clutching a positive pregnancy test, did not have it in him to fight for anything that required real courage. But some traitorous part of her remembered a different Julian, the one from before. The boy who used to drive 2 hours just to bring her soup when she had the flu. The boy who used to sit on the pier with her until 3 in the morning, talking about all the things he wanted to build with his life, and all the ways he wanted to build them differently than his father had. The boy who had once looked at her like she was the only steady thing in a world built entirely on shifting sand. That boy hadn't seemed like the type to disappear either. And yet, Julian's first morning back in Charleston felt like stepping into a memory that had been waiting 10 years to ambush him. The hotel suite Ashford Global had booked for him overlooked the harbor, and he stood at the window with his coffee going cold, watching sailboats cut white lines across its water, the exact shade of blue he remembered from a summer he'd tried, and failed, for a decade to forget. Everything in this city seemed designed to remind him of what he'd walked away from. The salt air, the wrought iron balconies, the particular slant of morning light through live oaks draped in Spanish moss. His phone buzzed. Marcus with the day's schedule, 9 a.m., site walkthrough, downtown campus location. 11:30 a.m., press briefing, city council. 2 p.m., meeting with local business coalition, neighborhood integration plan. Julian's eyes snagged on the 3rd item. He hadn't asked for that meeting specifically, but the location caught his attention immediately. A community roundtable, downtown, addressing how the new Ashford campus, would affect existing local businesses in the surrounding blocks, he knew, with the particular dread of a man who had spent 10 years being unable to stop himself from tracking every detail of a life he'd given up the right to be part of, exactly which businesses sat on those blocks. Whitfield and Bloom was 2 doors down from the proposed site entrance. He could pull out of the meeting, send a deputy, it would be easy. He was, after all, the CEO, and CEOs delegated constantly. No one would question it. But Julian had spent 10 years being a coward in exactly this particular way, always finding the easier road, always telling himself it was mercy when really it was fear wearing mercy's clothes. He set his coffee down, straightened his tie in the mirror, and made a decision that Marcus would later describe to the rest of the executive team as completely, uncharacteristically insane. "Marcus," he said into the phone, "add a stop to today's schedule. Before the community meeting, sir, your schedule's already. I need the address for a flower shop, Whitfield and Bloom." There was a pause on the line so long Julian thought the call had dropped. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was careful in the way of a man who had worked for Julian Ashford for 6 years and had learned to recognize the sound of his boss standing at the edge of something enormous. "Sir, is this about the file? The one in your desk drawer?" Julian closed his eyes. He had never explicitly told Marcus about the private investigator's reports, but Marcus was observant, and Julian had never been quite as careful as he thought he was. "Yes," Julian said simply. "It's about the file. Sir, I have to ask, are you sure you're ready for this? Whatever this is." Julian looked out at the harbor one more time, at the boats gliding across water. He'd once promised a 19-year-old girl he'd sail her across someday. On some future they'd been too young and too naive to know wouldn't survive contact with his father's ambitions. "No," he admitted, "but I'm going anyway." Whitfield and Bloom was busy that morning. A wedding order for 200 centerpieces had come in the week before, and Amara, Denise, and their part-time florist Sasha were elbow-deep in ranunculus and eucalyptus when the bell above the door chimed at 11:45. Amara didn't look up right away. "Be right with you. Take your time," said a voice she hadn't heard in 10 years, low and careful. Like a man walking across ice he wasn't sure would hold his weight. Amara's hands froze mid-stem, a pair of shears suspended over a half-finished centerpiece. Every sound in the shop seemed to fall away. The hum of the cooler, Sasha's radio playing softly in the back, Denise's sharp intake of breath from behind the register, until there was nothing left in the world except the sound of her own heartbeat, and the man standing in the doorway of her shop like a ghost she'd never quite managed to bury. Julian Ashford looked exactly like his photographs, and nothing like them at all. Taller than she remembered, or maybe just more solid, more settled into himself. A man instead of the boy she'd loved at 19. His suit probably cost more than her monthly rent, but his eyes, when they finally found hers across the shop, held none of the polished confidence she'd seen in every magazine profile and business article for the past decade. They held fear. Raw, unguarded fear, the kind she remembered from a hospital hallway a lifetime ago. "Amara," he said, and her name in his mouth after 10 years of silence hit her like a physical blow. Denise moved first, stepping around the counter with the protective instinct of a woman who'd watched her best friend cry herself hollow more nights than she could count. "You need to leave." "Denise." "It's fine." Amara's voice came out steadier than she felt, though her hands were shaking so badly she had to set the shears down before she cut herself. "I've got this, Amara." "It's fine," Amara repeated, and something in her tone made Denise back off. Though she didn't go far, she retreated to the far side of the shop, arms crossed, eyes locked on Julian like she was calculating exactly how fast she could reach the phone if she needed to call someone. Julian took a single step forward, then stopped himself, as if some invisible boundary had been drawn on the floor between them that he didn't have the right to cross. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I needed to see you. To say this in person, not through some text message like a coward. You've had 10 years to say it in person," Amara said. Her voice cracked despite her best efforts to keep it level. 10 years, Julian. Do you understand what those 10 years looked like for me?" "No," he said quietly. "I don't, and I know I don't have any right to ask you to tell me. But I want to, if you'll let me." Amara laughed, a short, disbelieving sound with no humor in it at all. "You want to know what it looked like? I gave birth alone, Julian. My mother held my hand because you weren't there. I worked 3 jobs while I was pregnant because your family's lawyers made sure the money I'd saved from my scholarship stipend didn't stretch as far as I needed it to. I built this shop from a folding table at the farmer's market because no bank would give a 19-year-old single mother a business loan. I have spent 10 years explaining to a little boy why his father has never once called, never once written, never once." Her voice broke entirely on the last word, and she hated herself for it, hated that after everything, he could still find the one crack in her armor she thought she'd sealed shut years ago. Julian's face had gone grey. "A little boy," he repeated so softly it was barely audible. Zion. The sound of his son's name in his mouth. A name Julian had clearly known, clearly researched, clearly kept tabs on from some safe and cowardly distance for years, was the final straw. "You know his name," Amara said, and it wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "You know his name, Julian, which means you've known about him this whole time. You've known and you chose to stay away." Julian didn't deny it. That somehow was worse than any excuse he could have offered. "I have a file," he said finally, voice raw. "A private investigator's report, updated every few months for the past 9 years. I have watched my son grow up through photographs I paid someone else to take, Amara, because I was too much of a coward to face what I'd done to you both. I told myself I was protecting you, protecting him. My father, he made it very clear what would happen if I—" "Don't!" Amara held up a hand, and it shook visibly in the air between them. "Don't you dare stand in my shop and blame your father for 10 years of your own choices. You were 22, Julian, not a child. A grown man who got on a private jet and never looked back." The shop had gone completely silent except for the low hum of the flower cooler. Sasha had frozen in the back doorway, clearly unsure whether to intervene or disappear entirely. Denise's hand had found her phone in her apron pocket, thumb hovering over the screen. Julian's jaw worked, his composure, the same composure that had built an empire, that had faced down boardrooms and hostile takeovers, and a father who ruled through fear, finally cracking entirely. "You're right," he said. "I was a coward. I have been a coward for 10 years, and I know that no apology, no amount of money, nothing I do or say is going to undo what I took from you and from him. But I'm asking you, begging you, for the chance to try, to meet him, to be in his life, in whatever way you'll allow. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Amara. I know I haven't earned that. I'm asking for a chance." Amara stared at him, 10 years of grief and grief-shaped rage rising in her chest all at once, and for one terrible, dizzying moment she genuinely didn't know which emotion would win. And then the shop door chimed again. "Mama?" Zion's voice, bright and unsuspecting, floated in from the entrance, his school bag still slung over one shoulder, cheeks flushed from his walk over with Miss Odessa trailing a few steps behind him, her face going stone still the moment she saw who was standing in the middle of the shop. "Mama? Grandma said I could come help with the wedding flowers, is that?" Zion stopped mid-sentence, his amber-flecked eyes, Julian's eyes, unmistakably, undeniably Julian's eyes, landed on the stranger standing frozen in the center of his mother's flower shop, and something in the air shifted so completely that even Zion, at 9 years old, felt it settle over the room like a held breath. "Who's that?" Zion asked slowly, looking between his mother's stricken face and the tall stranger who was staring at him like he'd just seen something impossible. Nobody answered. Julian Ashford, billionaire, CEO of a company worth $11 billion, a man who had negotiated deals in 6 countries and never once lost his composure in a boardroom, stood frozen in the doorway of a small Charleston flower shop, with tears he couldn't blink back standing in his eyes, looking at his son for the first time in 9 years. "Amara," he whispered, not taking his eyes off the boy. "Please, tell me, is that—" "Don't," Amara said, her voice shaking, stepping instinctively between Julian and her son. "Don't you dare say it here, not like this." But it was too late. Zion, sharp as his mother always said he was, looked from the stranger's face to his own reflection in the shop's front window, the same jaw, the same eyes, the same unruly curl at the crown of his head, and his young voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "Mama, he has my eyes." Zion's whisper hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. "He has my eyes." 9 years old and already sharper than most adults, twice his age, and in 3 words, he'd said the thing every grown person in that shop had been too afraid to say out loud. Odessa moved first, crossing the shop in 3 quick strides to press a protective hand against her grandson's shoulder. "Baby, why don't you go on back with Sasha? Help her with those centerpieces. I need to talk to your mama for a minute." "But, Zion." Amara's voice cracked on his name, but it carried enough weight that he obeyed, casting one last long look at Julian over his shoulder before Sasha gently steered him toward the back workroom, murmuring something about ribbon colors that neither of them believed he was actually listening to. The moment the workroom door swung shut, Amara rounded on Julian, every ounce of the composure she'd fought so hard to hold on to finally giving way. "You do not get to do that," she said, voice shaking with a rage so old it had roots. "You do not get to walk into my shop after 10 years of silence and let my son find out who you are by accident, standing in the middle of a wedding order with strangers watching." "I didn't plan this," Julian said, and for the first time, his composure, the boardroom mask he'd worn through the entire conversation, finally cracked all the way open. His eyes were wet. His hands, Amara noticed, were trembling at his sides. "Amara, I swear to you, I didn't know he'd walk in. I came here to talk to you. Just you. I wanted to do this right. There is no right way to do this, Julian. There was never going to be a right way, because the right way ended the day you got on that plane." Amara pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes, willing back tears she refused to let him see. He has spent his whole life asking me why his father doesn't want him. Do you understand that? I have had to find new and gentler ways to lie to my son for 9 years because the truth was too ugly to say out loud. That his father knew exactly where we were, exactly what we needed, and chose $11 billion over showing up. It was never about the money. Julian's voice broke. Amara, if you knew what those years actually looked like for me, I don't care what they looked like for you. The words tore out of her, loud enough that Denise took an instinctive step forward, and Julian flinched like she'd struck him. I don't care, Julian, because I lived my 10 years in the daylight, raising our son alone, and you lived yours behind glass walls with a file folder and a private investigator instead of the courage to pick up a phone. Silence fell across the shop, broken only by the distant murmur of Sasha's voice from the back room, patiently explaining ribbon widths to a 9-year-old who was, Amara knew without looking, not thinking about ribbon at all. Julian looked for a long moment like a man standing in the wreckage of something he'd built with his own 2 hands, and was only now, 10 years too late, beginning to understand the size of. You're right, he said quietly. About all of it. I don't have a defense, Amara. I'm not going to stand here and give you one, because there isn't one that would matter. But I'm asking you, not for myself. I gave up the right to ask anything for myself the day I left. I'm asking for him. For Zion. He deserves better than a lifetime of wondering why his father wasn't there. And I know I can't undo 9 years. But I can stop making it 10, 11, 20. Amara stared at him, her chest heaving, 10 years of carefully constructed walls trembling under the weight of a conversation she'd never once let herself imagine having. You have no idea what you're asking, she said finally, quieter now, exhaustion bleeding through the anger. You have no idea what it would mean to let you in and have you disappear again. I survived it once, Julian, barely. But Zion, he wouldn't survive it the same way. Children don't heal from that the way adults pretend to, then I won't disappear. Julian took a single step closer, close enough now that Amara could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there 10 years ago, evidence of nights he'd clearly spent the same way she had. Awake, aching, alone. Test me. Set every condition you want. I will meet every single one of them. For as long as it takes, for as long as you'll let me. I'm not asking you to trust me today. I'm asking you not to close the door before I've had the chance to prove I mean it. Behind the counter, Denise's phone buzzed loudly in the tense silence. A text from Odessa, who had slipped away to keep an eye on Zion, reading simply, "He's asking questions. I don't know how much longer I can hold him off." Amara closed her eyes. Somewhere in the back of the shop, she could hear her son's voice, high and curious, drifting through the thin workroom door. "Grandma, is that man my dad?" The entire shop went silent. Amara's eyes flew open, and for one long suspended moment, she and Julian simply stared at each other across the small space that 10 years, one betrayal, and one very perceptive 9-year-old had built between them, both of them frozen, both of them waiting to see which one of them would have to walk through that workroom door and finally tell Zion Whitfield the truth. Nobody moved. Then Amara did the only thing she'd been doing for 9 years every time the world threatened to break her son's heart. She walked forward, chin lifted, and did it herself, on her own terms, instead of letting it happen to her. "Stay here," she told Julian, her voice low but final. "You do not follow me back there. Not yet." Julian nodded once, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, he looked less like the CEO of a global empire, and more like a man who understood, completely and without argument, that he had no right to object to anything Amara Whitfield decided in that moment. She pushed through the workroom door to find Zion standing very still amid a table scattered with ribbon spools, Sasha hovering awkwardly nearby with the particular helplessness of a bystander who had wandered into a family's most private moment, and Odessa kneeling in front of her grandson with both hands wrapped gently around his. Zion looked up when his mother entered, and the raw, searching hope on his face nearly broke her in half. "Mama." His voice wobbled, all 9-year-old bravado gone. "Is he? Is that man my dad?" Amara crossed the room and sank down onto the stool across from him, taking both his hands from her mother's. She had rehearsed this moment 100 different ways over 9 years, in the shower, in the car, in the dead of night, when Zion had asked why other kids had dads at their soccer games and he didn't, and every single rehearsal fell apart now, in the face of his actual trembling voice. "Yes, baby," she said softly. "That's your father. His name is Julian." Zion's breath caught. His eyes, Julian's eyes, she thought again, with a pang that never quite dulled no matter how many years passed, filled with a dozen things at once. Hope, confusion, hurt, and underneath all of it, a hunger so old and so deep it made Amara's chest ache to look at it directly. "Why didn't he ever come see me?" Zion's voice cracked. "Was it because of something I did?" Miss Patterson said sometimes dads leave because... No, Amara's voice came out fierce, immediate, cutting through the thought before it could take root. No, baby, listen to me. This was never ever about you. You didn't do anything wrong. Not one single thing. Do you hear me? Then why? It was the question Amara had dreaded for 9 years. The one she'd never had to answer directly, because Julian had never been standing 30 feet away to answer it himself. She thought of 100 different lies she could tell. He was traveling. He didn't know. It was complicated. Every gentle fiction she'd built to protect her son from a truth too sharp for a child to hold. But Zion was 9 and brilliant, and he deserved better than another comfortable lie. He made a mistake, Amara said carefully. A big one. He was scared and young, and he let that fear make his decisions for a long time instead of doing what was right. That doesn't make it okay. It doesn't undo any of the years you didn't have him, but it also wasn't about you not being worth showing up for. You have always, always been worth showing up for. Zion absorbed this with the same solemn concentration he gave to his math homework, his young mind visibly working through the shape of a truth too large to fully fit yet. Is he going to leave again? Amara didn't have an answer for that one, not one she could offer with any honesty. I don't know, she admitted, but I promise you this, whatever happens, whatever he does or doesn't do, I am never ever going anywhere. You have me, you've always had me. Zion nodded slowly. Blinking hard against tears, he was clearly fighting not to let fall in front of his grandmother and Sasha. Then, in the sudden whiplash way of children, he asked the question that undid every adult in the room completely. Can I meet him? For real? Not just seeing him in the shop? Amara's throat tightened. Behind her, she heard Odessa exhale a long, unsteady breath. Do you want to? Amara asked gently. Jon nodded, small certain. I've wondered about him my whole life, Mama. I just want to know what he's like, even if he messed up. There it was, the terrifying, beautiful mercy of a child's heart, offering a grace that Amara herself hadn't been anywhere close to ready to extend. She looked at her son for a long moment, then finally nodded. Okay, we'll figure out how. But it's going to happen on our terms, Zion. Slow, careful, not all at once. Can you do that? I can do that. Zion wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, some of his usual spark returning despite the tears still clinging to his lashes. Mama, does he seem nice? Amara thought of Julian standing in the shop's front room, hands trembling, eyes wet, 10 years of buried grief finally cracking through a decade of careful, cowardly silence. I think, she said slowly, he might be trying to be. Whether that's enough, that's something we're all going to have to find out together. When Amara walked back into the front of the shop, Julian was exactly where she'd left him, standing motionless amid the half-finished centerpieces, looking like a man who had spent the last 10 minutes rehearsing and discarding 100 different things to say and arriving at none of them. He wants to meet you, Amara said without preamble. Properly. Not today. Not like this. Julian's whole body seemed to sag with relief, his shoulders dropping several inches, as though he'd been braced this entire time for the opposite answer. Amara, thank you. I promise you I will not. I'm not finished. Amara crossed her arms, her voice firm despite the exhaustion threading through it. This happens on my terms. Supervised at first. Short visits, no gifts, no grand gestures, no trying to buy back 9 years in an afternoon. He needs to get to know you as a person before he decides whether he wants you as a father. Do you understand me? Completely. Julian nodded, and something in his face, a steadiness Amara hadn't expected, hadn't seen from him even 10 years ago when he was supposedly the more confident of the two of them, settled into place. Whatever you need, whatever pace protects him. I meant what I said, Amara. I'm not here to disrupt his life. I'm here to earn a place in it if he'll let me have one, on his terms and yours. Amara studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the cracks she was sure had to be there, the tell, the lie, the same careless boy who'd once climbed into a car without looking back. She didn't find it. What she found instead unsettled her far more. A man who looked like he'd spent 10 years being slowly hollowed out by exactly the kind of regret she'd once, in her darkest and angriest moments, hoped he would feel. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it just felt like grief for all the years neither of them could get back. There's a park 2 blocks from here, she said finally. Waterfront Park. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. Public. My mother will be there. 1 hour. That's where we start. Saturday, Julian repeated, like the word itself was a gift he hadn't dared hope for. I'll be there. He hesitated at the door, hand on the frame, and turned back to look at her one more time, really look at her. The way he used to before everything fell apart, before glass towers and boardrooms and his father's cold ambitions had carved him into someone else entirely. Amara, he said quietly, for what it's worth, and I know it's not worth much, not after everything, you built something extraordinary. Him, this shop, the life you made out of what I left you with. You didn't just survive what I did. You built something beautiful in spite of it. Amara said nothing. She couldn't. Her throat had closed around 10 years of things she'd sworn she would never let him see her feel. Julian nodded once, like he understood, and walked out into the Charleston sunlight. leaving behind a shop full of scattered ribbon, half-finished centerpieces, and a woman standing very still in the wreckage of a door she'd sworn, for 10 years, would never open again. Denise broke the silence first, exhaling long and low from behind the counter. "Well," she said, "that happened." Amara laughed, a small, broken, disbelieving sound, somewhere between a sob and genuine amusement, and pressed both hands over her face. "Saturday," she said, mostly to herself. "God help me, Saturday." She had no idea that Saturday would bring far more than a park bench and an hour of careful small talk. 3 states away, in a locked drawer in his father's estate, a man named Reginald Ashford was already making a phone call that would ensure his son's reunion with an illegitimate grandchild. One who threatened a decade of carefully protected corporate succession plans would never be allowed to happen quietly. Reginald Ashford's study occupied the entire east wing of the family's Hilton Head estate, a room designed less for comfort than for intimidation. Dark mahogany, floor-to-ceiling portraits of Ashford men going back 4 generations, and a desk large enough to land a small aircraft on. At 73, Reginald still ran Ashford Global's board with the same iron grip he'd used to run his household for the past 40 years, and it was from behind that desk that he now sat listening to a private investigator's voice on speakerphone with an expression carved from granite. "Confirmed the boy's identity through the school enrollment records," the investigator was saying. "Zion Whitfield, age 9. DNA hasn't been formally tested, but the resemblance alone, combined with the timeline—" "I don't need you to tell me the boy is my grandson," Reginald said coldly. "I've known that for 9 years. What I need is confirmation that my son intends to do something reckless about it." "Sir, from what our contact observed at the flower shop yesterday, Mr. Ashford appeared to acknowledge the child publicly. There were witnesses, employees. If word gets out before the Charleston groundbreaking—" "It won't." Reginald's jaw tightened. "Not if I have anything to say about it." He ended the call and sat in silence for a long moment, staring at a portrait of his own father above the fireplace. A man who had built Ashford Global from a single steel mill into an empire, and who had taught Reginald exactly one lesson that mattered. Sentiment was a luxury poor men could afford and rich men could not. Julian had always been soft. Reginald had seen it in him since childhood, the way the boy flinched at cruelty, the way he'd once cried over a wounded bird, instead of understanding that weakness in any form, in any creature, simply meant it wasn't fit to survive. 10 years ago, Reginald had made the decision to correct that softness the only way he knew how, by removing its cause. A girl from the wrong side of Charleston, working class, unconnected, utterly unsuitable to stand beside an Ashford heir. Reginald had paid for the silence, arranged the reassignment to the New York office, and told himself he was saving his son from a mistake that would have cost the family everything. It had worked. For 10 years, now his son was flying back to the very city. Reginald had spent a decade keeping him away from, meeting with the woman and the child Reginald had paid considerable sums to ensure remained a footnote instead of a headline, and threatening to unravel a succession plan that had taken Reginald the better part of 2 decades to construct. One in which Julian's cousin, Preston, clean, married, appropriately connected, stood next in line to inherit controlling interest the moment any hint of scandal made Julian unfit to lead. Reginald picked up his phone again and dialed a different number, not the investigator this time, but his personal attorney. "I need the Whitfield paternal rights agreement drafted by end of week," he said without preamble. "The one we discussed. Full financial settlement, non-disclosure, relocation assistance if necessary. I want it airtight, and I want it ready before my son does something we can't undo." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, if Mr. Ashford has already acknowledged the child publicly, an NDA at this stage may not." "Then make it generous enough that she signs it anyway," Reginald snapped. "Everyone has a price, counselor. Even proud women with flower shops and fatherless sons. Find hers." He hung up before the attorney could respond and turned back to the window, looking out over grounds that had been in his family for 3 generations. Grounds his own grandson, Zion, would likely never see, would likely never even know existed, if Reginald had anything to say about it. "This is for the family," he told himself, the same lie he'd told himself for 10 years. "Julian will thank me eventually." Just as he did the last time, he didn't yet know that this time, his son had already made a decision that no amount of money, pressure, or paternal manipulation would be able to undo. Saturday morning arrived in Charleston, wrapped in soft gold light and the particular hush of a coastal city just beginning to wake. Waterfront Park was nearly empty at 10 a.m. A few joggers, an elderly couple feeding the pigeons near the famous pineapple fountain, the gentle creak of the porch swings along the promenade. Amara arrived 15 minutes early with Zion, who had changed his outfit 4 times that morning, and was now visibly vibrating with a mixture of excitement and terror he was doing a valiant job trying to hide. "You okay?" Amara asked, smoothing down the collar of his shirt for the 3rd time. "I'm fine." Zion's voice came out an octave higher than usual. Do I look okay? Should I have worn the blue shirt instead? You look perfect, baby. Amara knelt down to his eye level, cupping his face in both hands. Remember, this is just an hour. Just talking. If you want to leave at any point, for any reason you tell me, and we go. No explanation needed. Okay? Zion nodded, swallowing hard. Behind them, Odessa hovered a few feet back, arms crossed, eyes already scanning the park entrance with the vigilance of a woman prepared to intervene at the first sign of trouble. At exactly 10 o'clock, a black car pulled up at the park's edge, and Julian Ashford stepped out. Dressed down, Amara noticed, in a simple button-down and khakis instead of the suit he'd worn to the shop, as though he'd understood without being told, that today was not a day for reminding his son of everything money could buy that time could not. He walked toward them slowly, hands visibly shaking at his sides, and stopped a respectful distance away, crouching down to Zion's eye level the moment he was close enough. "Hi, Zion," he said, voice unsteady. "I'm Julian. It's really good to meet you." Zion stared at him for a long, searching moment, the same searching look Amara remembered him giving new foods, new books, new ideas, the careful assessment of a child who thought deeply before he ever spoke. "You have my eyes," Zion said finally. "Well, I guess I have your eyes, since you're older." A sound came out of Julian that was half law, half sob, entirely unguarded. "Yeah, I guess you do. Mom says you make renewable energy stuff, solar panels and things. That's right. Do you know how photovoltaic cells actually work? Like the physics of it, because my science teacher explained it, but I don't think she really understood it herself." Julian blinked, visibly caught off guard, and something in his face shifted. Surprise giving way to a helpless, dawning wonder. "I do, actually. Do you want me to explain it?" Zion's whole face lit up, 9 years of careful reserve cracking open in an instant. "Yes, please. Everyone always just says sunlight makes electricity, and it's so much more interesting than that." And just like that, sitting cross-legged on the grass of Waterfront Park with the morning sun glinting off the harbor behind them, Julian Ashford began explaining the photoelectric effect to his 9-year-old son in painstaking, patient detail. While Amara stood a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself, watching a moment she'd never once let herself imagine actually happening, Odessa came to stand beside her, following her gaze. "Well," she murmured, "would you look at that?" "Don't," Amara warned quietly, though there was no real heat in it. "One good conversation about solar panels doesn't undo 10 years, Mama. I know that." Odessa's voice was gentler than Amara expected. "I'm just saying that's the first time I've seen that boy's whole face light up like that over something that wasn't a book." Amara didn't answer, because she couldn't trust her own voice. She watched Julian gesture animatedly, watched Zion lean forward rapt, asking rapid-fire questions with the particular relentlessness that had gotten him labeled exceptionally gifted, and occasionally exhausted every teacher he'd ever had, and felt something complicated and painful crack open in her chest. For 9 years, she had been everything to Zion: mother, father, provider, protector, and some small, guilty, exhausted part of her had never let herself imagine what it might feel like to share that weight with someone else. To watch someone else's face light up with the same wonder Zion's did. To not be the only adult in the world who understood exactly how extraordinary her son was. She was still standing there, lost in that thought, when her phone buzzed sharply in her pocket. She almost didn't check it. But something, instinct maybe, or 10 years of learning to always expect the worst from anything connected to the Ashford name, made her glance down at the screen. It was an email notification, subject line stark against the preview text. Whitfield Settlement Agreement, confidential. Ashford Global Legal Department. Amara's blood ran cold. She opened it with trembling hands, scanning the first paragraph, and felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. It was an offer, a substantial one, more money than she'd see in 10 lifetimes of running her shop, in exchange for her signature on a non-disclosure agreement, full relinquishment of any future claim to the Ashford name or fortune on Zion's behalf, and a clause, buried in dense legal language near the bottom, requiring her and Zion to relocate at least 500 miles from any current or future Ashford Global business operations. The sender wasn't Julian, it was Reginald Ashford. Amara looked up sharply from her phone, across the park, to where Julian sat laughing with their son in the golden morning light, utterly unaware that 3 states away, his father had just tried to pay Amara to disappear. Amara's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. She read the email a second time, then a third, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less monstrous. They didn't. Full relinquishment of any future claim to the Ashford name or fortune. Relocation assistance if necessary, minimum 500 miles from current or future Ashford Global operations. A dollar figure at the bottom of the document large enough to make her stomach turn, because she understood, instantly and completely, exactly what it was meant to purchase, not her silence, her disappearance. "Mama?" Odessa's voice cut through the roaring in her ears. "Amara, baby. What's wrong? You've gone grey." Amara turned the phone toward her mother without a word, watching Odessa's face cycle through confusion, comprehension, and finally a rage so complete it seemed to age her 10 years in the space of a single breath. "That old devil," Odessa hissed. "That old, cold-blooded. Not here." Amara's voice came out clipped, controlled in the particular way she'd learned to control herself for 9 years whenever the world threatened to fall apart in front of her son. She glanced across the park, where Julian was now showing Zion how to skip a flat stone across the harbor's edge, both of them laughing at his son's spectacularly unsuccessful first attempt. "Not in front of him. Not today, Amara. That man just tried to pay you to vanish." "I know what he did, Mama." Amara pressed her fingers to her temples, breathing hard. "I need to think." But there wasn't much thinking required, not really. Every instinct in her body was screaming the same thing it had screamed 10 years ago, standing outside that hospital with a phone that wouldn't stop going to voicemail, that the Ashford family did not want her, had never wanted her, and would spend whatever it cost to remove her and her son from the narrative of their empire like an inconvenient footnote. The difference was 10 years ago she'd had no power at all. Now she had a business, a community, a mother who would go to war for her without blinking, and apparently a son who could reduce a billionaire CEO to tears over a game of skipping stones. She watched Julian a moment longer, watched the unguarded, almost boyish joy on his face as Zion finally landed a decent skip and threw both arms in the air in triumph, and made a decision. She wasn't going to hide this from him. Whatever else Julian Ashford was, whatever 10 years of cowardice he owed her for, she needed to know today whether he was his father's son or not. "Julian," she called out, crossing the grass. "Can I speak with you? Alone?" Something in her tone must have carried, because his smile faded instantly, replaced by the wary alertness of a man who'd learned to read danger in boardrooms for a living. "Of course." He turned to Zion. "Buddy, give me 5 minutes, okay? I'll be right back." "Okay." Zion, blissfully unaware, immediately turned to Odessa. "Grandma, did you know a flat stone skips because of the angle it hits the water? It's basically the same physics as—" Amara didn't hear the rest. She was already walking Julian several yards down the promenade, out of earshot, phone still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. She handed it to him without a word. Julian read the email in silence, and Amara watched his expression change in real time, confusion, then dawning horror, then something that looked almost like physical pain. "No," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear him. "No, no, no." He scrolled to the bottom, checking the sender, the letterhead, the date, as if some part of him was still hoping it was a mistake. "This is Amara. I swear to you I had no idea. I did not authorize this. I would never authorize this, but your father did." Julian's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped visibly in his cheek. "My father," he said, "has been trying to control every decision I make since I was 7 years old, including this one, especially this one." He looked up at her, and the fear she'd seen in him at the shop 3 days ago was back, but sharper now, edged with a fury she hadn't seen from him since he was 22, and screaming at Reginald Ashford through a phone Amara had never been allowed to hear the other side of. "This ends today. I promise you. Amara, this ends today. You've made me promises before, Julian." The words landed exactly as hard as she meant them to. Julian flinched, absorbing the hit without argument, because they both knew she had every right to land it. "I know," he said, "and I know a promise from me doesn't mean much right now, so don't take my word for it. Watch what I do instead." He handed her back the phone, already pulling his own from his pocket, thumb moving fast across the screen. "I'm calling my father right now, in front of you. And then I'm going to have Marcus draft a formal statement to the board making it clear that any further contact with you, legal, financial, or otherwise, happens through me, and only with your full knowledge and consent." He dialed. Amara watched, arms crossed, heart still hammering, as the call connected and Reginald Ashford's voice, cold, clipped, unmistakably patrician, came through the speaker. "Julian, I assume you're calling about the arrangement. You mean the 6-figure bribe you sent to the mother of my son to make them both disappear." Julian's voice was ice, a register Amara had never once heard from him, not even in the worst of their arguments a decade ago. "Withdraw it now. Today, Julian, be reasonable. This is a business matter, and a generous one at that. That woman would be set for life, and the boy. His name is Zion." Julian's hand had gone white-knuckled around the phone. "And he is not a matter, Dad. He's my son, your grandson. And if you send one more email, one more attorney, one more phone call to Amara Whitfield without my explicit approval, I will remove myself from the CEO position of Ashford Global effective immediately, sell my controlling shares to whoever offers the fastest close, and let you watch Preston run the company you've spent 40 years building directly into the ground. Do you understand me?" There was a long, taut silence on the line. "You wouldn't," Reginald said finally, though something in his voice had shifted, a flicker of genuine uncertainty Amara suspected very few people had ever heard from him. "Try me," Julian said, and ended the call. Amara stared at him, stunned into silence as Julian stood there breathing hard, phone still clenched in his fist, 10 years of buried anger at his own father finally boiling over into the open air. "I meant that," he said, turning to her, chest still heaving. "Every word. I don't expect it to undo what I did to you, Amara. But I need you to know, whatever happens next, whatever my father tries, I am not going to let him touch you or Zion again. Not this time." Amara opened her mouth to respond. She genuinely didn't know what she was going to say, whether it would be gratitude or fresh accusation or some tangled combination of both, when a small voice piped up from several yards away. "Mama? Julian?" Zion had wandered closer, curiosity overriding whatever instructions he'd been given to wait with his grandmother. He was looking between the two adults with a particular perceptiveness that made him impossible to lie to. "Is everything okay? You both look really serious." Julian recovered first, crouching down with a smile that Amara, watching closely now, searching for any sign of performance, could tell was genuine, even through the visible strain still tightening the corners of his eyes. "Everything's okay, buddy," he said. "Your mom and I were just talking about grown-up stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." Zion narrowed his eyes with the exact skepticism Amara recognized from her own reflection. That's what adults say when it's actually something to worry about. Despite everything, despite the fury still coursing hot through her veins, Amara felt a small, involuntary huff of laughter escape her chest. "He's got you there," Julian smiled. A real one, surprised out of him, and for just a moment, standing in the golden Charleston sunlight with their son, studying them both with the same relentless intelligence that had gotten him, labeled exceptionally gifted. Something in the air between the three of them shifted into something that almost, dangerously, felt like the beginning of a family. It was Odessa's voice, sharp and urgent, that shattered the moment entirely. "Amara." She was hurrying across the grass toward them, phone pressed to her ear, face pale with alarm. "Amara, baby, you need to see this. It's already online. Someone leaked it to the press." "Leaked what?" Amara's stomach dropped. Odessa turned her phone around and there, splashed across the screen of a local Charleston gossip site under a blaring headline, was a grainy photograph, taken from across the street through the flower shop's front window, clearly snapped days ago, of Julian standing frozen in Whitfield and Bloom, staring at Zion with an expression of undeniable, unmistakable recognition. The headline read, "Billionaire Ashford CEO's secret love child discovered in Charleston. Exue photos inside." Amara's blood turned to ice. "Who?" she started, but Julian was already there beside her, staring at the screen with an expression of dawning, horrified fury. "My father," he said grimly. "He didn't just try to buy your silence, Amara. When that didn't work fast enough, he made sure the whole world found out before either of us was ready, so that no matter what I do now, it looks like scandal. Damage control. A story he gets to control the narrative of instead of us." "Why would he do that?" Amara's voice was shaking. "That destroys the company's reputation just as much as it destroys ours." Julian's jaw tightened, his eyes going hard and cold in a way that for the first time made Amara understand exactly how he'd built an $11 billion empire by the age of 32. "Because it doesn't destroy the company," he said quietly. "It destroys me. My father doesn't care about protecting Ashford Global's reputation, Amara. He cares about controlling who inherits it. And a public scandal involving an out-of-wedlock son from a working-class mother in Charleston is exactly the kind of story that makes a board nervous enough to start asking whether I'm still fit to lead this company." He looked up, meeting Amara's eyes, and what she saw there wasn't fear anymore. It was something colder, sharper, more determined. "He's not trying to protect the Ashford name," Julian said. "He's trying to replace me with my cousin Preston, and he just used our son to do it." Zion, still standing beside them, looked up at his mother with wide, frightened eyes. "Mama, what's happening? Why is everyone so upset?" Amara knelt down instantly, pulling her son into her arms, holding him tight against the sudden chaos exploding around them. Reporters, presumably, already beginning to circle, a decade-old secret splashed across the internet before she'd even had the chance to explain it to Zion's own teacher, and a billionaire family war she and her son had just been dragged into without any say in the matter at all. "It's going to be okay," she murmured into his curls, though for the first time since Julian had walked back into her life 4 days ago, she genuinely didn't know if that was true. Over Zion's head she met Julian's eyes and saw in them a promise and a warning in equal measure. "I need you to trust me," Julian said quietly. "Just for the next 48 hours. I know I haven't earned that, but I need you to let me fix this, the right way, publicly on our terms, before my father gets to write the story for us." Amara held her son tighter, feeling the eyes of strangers already beginning to turn their way across the park, phones lifting, whispers starting. "You have 48 hours, she said finally, voice steel-edged. "And Julian," If you disappear on us again, this time there won't be a second chance. Not for you, and not for your father's money either. Julian nodded once, solemn as a vow. Understood, he said. Neither of them yet knew that Reginald Ashford's next move, already set in motion before Julian had even hung up the phone, would force a decision that would determine not just the fate of Ashford Global, but whether Julian Ashford would ever truly become the father his son deserved. By Monday morning, the story had metastasized far beyond a single Charleston gossip site. Amara woke to 43 missed calls, a shop voicemail box that had maxed out overnight, and a driveway occupied by 2 vans with satellite dishes parked illegally on the grass verge outside her house. Mama. Zion stood at the living room window in his pajamas, staring out at the small crowd of reporters gathered on the sidewalk. Why are there so many cameras? Come away from the window, baby. Amara pulled the curtain shut and steered him toward the kitchen, where Odessa was already flipping pancakes with the grim determination of a woman who intended for her grandson's morning to feel as normal as humanly possible despite the circus outside. Amara's phone buzzed again. Not a reporter this time. Julian, don't go to the shop today. I'm sending security. We need to talk before you say anything to anyone, please. She stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, Zion has school. I'm not hiding him like he did something wrong. I know. I'm not asking you to hide him. I'm asking you to let me help protect him while we figure out how to control this. Amara set the phone down, jaw tight, and looked over at her son shoveling pancakes into his mouth with his usual 9-year-old enthusiasm, blissfully unaware that his entire life had become tabloid fodder overnight because of a decision 2 grown men had made about him without ever once asking what he wanted. She hated that Julian was right. She hated it more that some small exhausted part of her was relieved someone else was finally helping carry the weight. By the time Amara arrived at Whitfield and Bloom 2 hours later, Zion safely delivered to school under the watchful eye of 2 of Julian's security detail, a compromise she'd agreed to only after Zion himself had rolled his eyes and said, Mom, it's kind of cool. Actually, the shop's front window had been plastered with a hastily printed sign reading closed for private family matters, and Denise was standing guard at the door like a bouncer at an exclusive club. You would not believe the morning I've had, Denise said, ushering her inside and locking the door behind her. 3 news vans, a guy from some entertainment blog offering me $5,000 for insider details, and your mother nearly hit somebody with her car backing out of the driveway. She did not. She came close. Denise's expression softened. How are you holding up? I don't know. Amara sank onto the stool behind the counter, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. 4 days ago, my biggest problem was a wedding order for 200 centerpieces. Now I'm a headline. The shop's back door opened, and Julian stepped through it, having clearly been let in through the alley entrance to avoid the reporters still camped out front, followed by a woman Amara didn't recognize, sharply dressed, carrying a leather portfolio and radiating the particular calm competence of someone paid a great deal of money to fix exactly this kind of disaster. Amara, this is Renata Cole, Julian said, best crisis communications strategist in the country. I called her the moment the story broke. Renata extended a hand, which Amara shook warily. Mrs. Whitfield, I know this is overwhelming, and I know you didn't ask for any of this. I'm here to make sure that from this point forward, you and your son control the narrative, not Reginald Ashford, and not the tabloids. And how exactly do we do that? Amara asked. Renata set her portfolio on the counter and opened it, revealing pages of talking points, statement drafts, and what looked like a proposed media strategy already half-built. Honestly, the best path forward is the one most people running from a story like this never choose. Total transparency, on your terms, before anyone else gets to define it for you. A single, carefully controlled interview. You and Julian together, telling your story in your own words. Not defensive, not scandalous, just true. Absolutely not, Amara said immediately. I am not putting my son in front of cameras. Zio wouldn't be part of it, Renata said quickly. This is about the 2 of you, the history, the truth of what happened 10 years ago, and Julian publicly acknowledging his son and taking responsibility for the years he was absent. It removes the ammunition. It's much harder for Reginald Ashford to spin this as a scandal when the 2 people at the center of it have already told the real story, with dignity, on their own terms. Amara looked at Julian, who had remained quiet throughout Renata's pitch, watching her reaction with careful, deliberate patience. No pressure, no pushing, just waiting. This is your call, he said. Entirely. If you say no, we find another way. I won't ask you to do anything you're not comfortable with, Amara. Not again. Not ever. Something about the not again, the quiet acknowledgement of every choice that had once been stripped from her without her consent, softened something in Amara's chest, even through her exhaustion and her lingering fury. I need to think about it, she said finally. This isn't a decision I'm making standing in my own flower shop with reporters camped outside. Of course. Renata nodded, gathering her portfolio. Take whatever time you need. I'll be in touch through Julian. After she left, an uneasy quiet settled over the shop. Denise busied herself pretending to reorganize a display of gerbera daisies that didn't need reorganizing, giving them the semblance of privacy. There's something else, Julian said quietly, once they were alone. My father's attorney called this morning. He's requesting a paternity test. Amara's head snapped up. Excuse me? Officially, it's framed as due diligence, protecting the company from a false claim before any statement is made. Julian's jaw tightened, disgust evident in every line of his face. Unofficially, I think he's hoping it buys him time, delays everything long enough for him to find another angle. There's no question Zion is yours, Julian. Look at him. I know that. You know that. But my father is going to use every legal maneuver available to slow this down, because every day this drags out is another day he can work the board behind the scenes. Julian rubbed a hand over his face, and for a moment, Amara saw exactly how tired he actually was beneath the composed exterior. Dark circles, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of very little sleep since he'd arrived in Charleston. I'll take the test, today if it helps this move faster. I just needed you to hear it from me before his lawyers contacted you directly. Fine, Amara crossed her arms. But Julian, if this is a delay tactic, if this is your father trying to buy time to come after us again. It won't work, Julian said with a certainty that startled her. I already told the board this morning, before Renata even got here. I'm holding an emergency session Thursday. I'm going to lay out everything. The paternity, the settlement offer my father tried to push through behind my back. All of it, and I'm asking them to remove him from any operational decision-making authority regarding this matter. Amara stared at him. You're going after your own father. Publicly. In front of the board. I should have done it 10 years ago, Julian said quietly. I let him control every decision that mattered because I was afraid of losing everything he'd built, everything he'd promised me. I lost you and Zion instead. I'm not making that mistake again. Something in his voice, steady, resolved, entirely unlike the trembling, guilt-racked man who'd walked into her shop 4 days earlier, made Amara look at him with something dangerously close to reconsideration. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something that acknowledged, for the first time, that the man standing in front of her might genuinely be different from the boy who'd left. Thursday, she said. That's fast. My father moves fast when he thinks he can win, Julian said grimly. I need to move faster. Thursday arrived wrapped in a tension so thick it seemed to hum in the air of Ashford Tower's 40th floor boardroom. Julian stood at the head of the long glass table, 12 board members watching him with expressions ranging from cautious support to open skepticism, while Reginald Ashford sat at the far end, flanked by his personal attorney, his face an unreadable mask of controlled fury. Amara wasn't there. She'd made it clear this was Julian's fight to have with his own family, and Julian had respected that, but she waited 3 states away, phone in hand, for the update he'd promised to send the moment it was over. Before we begin the quarterly review, Julian said, voice carrying clearly across the room, I need to address a personal matter that has become a corporate one, given recent press coverage. A murmur rippled through the board. Reginald's expression didn't shift, but his knuckles whitened slightly against the arm of his chair. 10 years ago, I fathered a son with a woman named Amara Whitfield, Julian continued, and I was absent from his life for 9 of those 10 years, a decision I made under significant pressure from my father, who believed that acknowledging a child born outside of a socially advantageous marriage would damage this company's reputation and threaten the succession plan he'd built around me. Reginald's attorney leaned in to whisper something urgent. Reginald waved him off, eyes locked on his son with an intensity that would have made a lesser man falter. Last week, Julian went on, I learned that my father, without my knowledge or consent, attempted to pressure Ms. Whitfield into signing a settlement agreement that would have permanently removed her and my son from any future contact with his family. And when that failed, he ensured the story was leaked to the press in a form designed to paint us as a scandal, rather than allowing us the dignity of telling our own story. This is a private family matter, Reginald said icily, not appropriate for a board meeting. It stopped being private the moment you tried to weaponize corporate resources to bury it. Julian shot back, and the room went utterly silent. I have documentation of the settlement offer sent under Ashford Global's legal letterhead, authorized without my signature or knowledge. I have phone records of the call where you threatened to accelerate Preston's position on the board if I didn't handle the situation quietly. And I have a paternity test completed this Tuesday, confirming that Zion Whitfield is my son, a fact I have never once denied, and never will again. He turned to address the full board directly. I'm not asking for sympathy. What happened to Amara and my son over the past decade is a direct result of my own cowardice, and I bear full responsibility for that. But what my father did this week, Attempting to use company resources to erase a 9-year-old child from public record for the sake of protecting a succession plan, that is not a personal failing. That is a material risk to every shareholder in this room, and it needs to be addressed as one. He slid a folder down the table toward the board's general counsel. I'm formally requesting that the board investigate my father's unauthorized use of company legal resources in this matter, and that his current advisory role be suspended pending that investigation. I will submit to any additional scrutiny the board deems necessary regarding my own fitness to continue as CEO, but I will not sit in this room and pretend that what happened this week was a private matter that has no bearing on how this company is run. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Reginald Ashford sat utterly still, and for the first time in his son's memory looked genuinely, completely uncertain of what was about to happen. It was the board's longest-serving independent director, a sharp-eyed woman named Helena Vasquez, who had known both Reginald and Julian since Julian was a teenager, who finally broke the silence. "Julian," she said slowly, "are you telling this board that your father authorized a payment, using company legal resources, to suppress information about your paternity, for the explicit purpose of protecting his preferred succession candidate?" "Yes," Julian said simply. "I have the documentation." Helena turned to Reginald, her expression hardening. "Reginald, is that true?" Reginald's jaw worked once, twice, and for a moment Amara, had she been in the room, would have seen something she'd never once expected to witness. The great, immovable patriarch of the Ashford Empire, cornered with nowhere left to hide. "I did what I believed was necessary to protect this company," Reginald said finally, voice tight with a fury he could no longer fully mask. "This company will not survive being run by sentiment, Julian. It survives through discipline, through strategic decisions unclouded by—" "By what?" Julian's voice rose for the first time, 10 years of buried grief and rage finally breaking through his careful composure. "By love, Dad? By basic human decency? You cost me 10 years with my son because you decided love was a liability, and now you tried to erase him a second time because a headline threatened your control of this boardroom. I am done letting you decide what my family is worth." The silence that followed was absolute. Helena Vasquez looked around the table, gathering the expressions of her fellow board members before finally speaking again. "I move that we suspend Reginald Ashford's advisory role, effective immediately, pending a full independent investigation into unauthorized use of corporate legal resources," she said. "All in favor?" Hands rose slowly around the table. First one, then 3, then, within seconds, a clear majority. Reginald Ashford sat motionless as the vote carried, staring at his son across the long glass table with an expression that had finally entirely lost its composure. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, standing, gathering his things with shaking hands. "Everything I built—" "You built an empire," Julian said, meeting his father's eyes without flinching for the first time in his entire life. "I'm trying to build a family. I'm done choosing the empire." Reginald left the boardroom without another word, his attorney trailing behind him, and the door swung shut with a soft, final click that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. Julian stood at the head of the table, breathing hard, 10 years of fear and guilt and cowardice, finally, visibly, lifting off his shoulders in real time, and then he pulled out his phone with trembling hands and typed a single message to Amara. "It's done. He's out. I chose you and Zion. I'll always choose you and Zion." 300 miles away, sitting in her car outside Zion's school waiting for the final bell, Amara Whitfield read the message twice, and for the first time in 10 years, allowed herself to cry tears that weren't entirely made of grief. But even as relief washed over her, she had no way of knowing that Reginald Ashford, walking out of that boardroom with nothing left to lose, was already forming a plan far more dangerous than any settlement offer. One that wouldn't stop at threatening Julian's career, but would put Amara and Zion themselves directly in harm's way. Reginald Ashford did not go quietly. By Friday morning, less than 24 hours after his suspension from Ashford Global's board, he had retreated not to his Hilton Head estate but to a private compound 2 hours outside Charleston that few people, including his own son, knew he still owned. It had belonged to his late wife's family, a sprawling property surrounded by marshland and old oak trees, purchased decades ago and quietly maintained ever since as a place Reginald went when he needed to think without an audience. He was not, however, alone this time. "You understand what you're asking me to do," said the man seated across from him, not an attorney this time, but someone from an entirely different professional category, a man Reginald had used exactly twice before in his life, both times to make problems disappear that the law was too slow to handle. "This isn't a settlement negotiation anymore, Reginald. You're talking about applying real pressure. The kind that leaves marks. I'm talking about protecting 40 years of my life's work from a sentimental fool and a woman who doesn't understand what she's stepped into," Reginald said coldly. "I don't care what it costs." "There are lines," the man said carefully. "Even for me. I'm not asking you to hurt anyone." Reginald's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent his entire life believing that if he simply refused to name the ugliest version of his own intentions, he could remain innocent of them. "I'm asking you to make her understand that Charleston is not a safe place for her son to grow up. Financial pressure, business disruption, a little encouragement to relocate somewhere further from my son's reach." The man across from him studied Reginald for a long moment, weighing something behind his eyes that Reginald didn't particularly care to examine. "That shop of hers," the man said finally. "Small business loans, contractor relationships, health inspections. Charleston's a tight-knit town. Things like that can fall apart fast if the right pressure gets applied in the right places. No one gets hurt, just motivated to leave. Do it," Reginald said, "whatever it costs." Neither man in that room understood, in that moment, just how badly this plan was about to go wrong. Nor did they know that Reginald's own attorney, disturbed by the unauthorized settlement offer he'd been ordered to draft the week before, had already quietly begun cooperating with the board's independent investigation, documenting every instruction Reginald gave him from that point forward. Amara noticed the first sign of trouble on Monday, when her shop's health inspector, the same man who'd given Whitfield and Bloom glowing reviews for 6 straight years, arrived unannounced with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "I need to do a full walkthrough. Received a complaint." "A complaint?" Amara set down the arrangement she'd been working on, confusion giving way slowly to a cold, familiar dread. "About what exactly?" "Anonymous," the inspector said, clearly uncomfortable. "Something about improper chemical storage, pest concerns." Amara had run her shop for 8 years without a single citation. She watched, arms crossed, jaw tight, as the inspector combed through every inch of her small, spotless business, finding, as she'd known he would, absolutely nothing. But the visit itself cost her 2 hours of business, a rattled staff, and a feeling in her stomach that told her this was only the beginning. It was Denise who connected the dots 3 days later, storming into the shop with her laptop already open. "Amara, our business loan. The one from Palmetto Community Bank, the one we've been paying down for 6 years without a single late payment." Denise turned the screen toward her. "They just sent a notice. They're calling in a review of our credit line. Says here they've received information warranting reassessment of risk." "What information?" "It doesn't say. But Amara, this bank has never once questioned us. 6 years, perfect payment history, and suddenly they're threatening to freeze our credit line." Denise's expression had gone hard. "This isn't a coincidence. Not with everything else going on." Amara closed her eyes, exhaustion and fury warring in her chest in equal measure. She thought of Julian's confidence at the boardroom, his certainty that removing his father from the company's operational authority would be enough to end this. She should have known better than to believe it would be that simple. She called Julian immediately, and within the hour he was standing in her shop again, face grim as he listened to the full account. The health inspection, the bank's sudden scrutiny, a whispered rumor Denise had picked up from a supplier that Whitfield and Bloom's wholesale flower contract might be quietly terminated at the end of the month for unrelated business reasons. "This is him," Julian said, jaw tight with fury. "This has his fingerprints all over it. He's out of the boardroom, so he's trying to squeeze you financially instead. Force you out of business, out of the city, without ever having to touch the company directly. Can he do that? Even suspended? He shouldn't be able to. But my father has 40 years of relationships in this state. Bankers, contractors, city officials who owe him favors. He doesn't need Ashford Global's resources to make your life difficult. He just needs a phone and a grudge." Julian ran a hand through his hair, visibly working through options. "I'm going to have Renata's team dig into every one of these, the health complaint, the bank review, the supplier rumor. If there's a paper trail connecting any of it back to him, that's not just a corporate liability anymore, that's harassment. Possibly criminal, Julian." Amara's voice was tight. "I don't want a legal battle. I want my son safe and I want my business left alone. That's it. That's all I've ever wanted." "I know." Julian's expression softened, though the fury underneath didn't fully fade. "And I'm going to make sure you get exactly that. I promise you." It was, Amara would think later, the 3rd time in 2 weeks Julian had made her a promise. And despite every instinct honed by a decade of disappointment, some small, cautious part of her was just starting, to believe he might actually keep this one. The situation came to a head on a warm Thursday evening 2 weeks later, when Amara left the shop later than usual, alone, to lock up after a long day preparing for a large corporate order. The street outside was quiet, streetlights just beginning to flicker on against a deepening indigo sky, when a black sedan pulled up to the curb beside her. Not Julian's car, she registered immediately, something colder crawling up her spine. and the passenger window rolled down. Whitfield. The man inside was middle-aged, unremarkable in a way that felt deliberately cultivated, the kind of face designed to be forgotten. "Got a minute? I don't know you," Amara said, keys clenched tight in her fist, already calculating the distance back to the shop's locked door. "No, you don't, but I know quite a bit about you." His tone remained mild, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. "Successful little shop. Sweet boy Zion, isn't it? 4th grade, gifted program, walks to school most mornings unless his grandmother drives him." He let that hang in the air for a moment, watching her face carefully. It would be a real shame if something happened to disrupt a life that peaceful. Charleston's got its risks, same as anywhere. Businesses fail. Accidents happen. Children get hurt in all kinds of ordinary ways nobody can ever really trace back to anyone in particular. Amara's blood turned to ice, every protective instinct in her body igniting at once. "Are you threatening my son?" "I'm making an observation," the man said pleasantly, "about how much easier life could be for you and the boy both, somewhere further from Charleston, somewhere further from certain complications. There's a very generous relocation package still on the table if you're interested in reconsidering. Get away from me." Amara's voice shook, but she didn't back down, planting herself firmly between the car and the shop's front door. "Get away from me right now, or I am calling the police." The man studied her for a long moment, something flickering behind his carefully neutral expression. Not quite respect, but something close to recalculation. "Have a good evening, Miss Whitfield," he said finally, and the window rolled up, the car pulling smoothly away into the darkening street, leaving Amara standing alone on the sidewalk with her heart slamming against her ribs and her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial her phone. She didn't call the police first. She called Julian. He picked up on the first ring. "Amara, what's wrong?" "A man just threatened Zion." Her voice broke completely, 10 years of hard-won composure shattering in an instant. "Julian, a man just sat outside my shop and told me things could happen to my son if I didn't take the relocation offer. He knew Zion's school schedule. He knew everything." There was a beat of absolute silence on the line, and when Julian spoke again, his voice had dropped into something Amara had never heard from him before. Low, lethal, entirely without the guilt or hesitation that had colored every conversation since he'd walked back into her life. "I'm coming right now," he said. "Don't move. Stay where there are people. I'm calling Marcus to get security to you in the next 10 minutes, and then I'm calling the police myself, and then—" He stopped, and Amara heard something in his breathing shift, something hardening into absolute resolve. "And then I'm calling my father. Because if he thinks threatening my son is going to make me back down, he has spent the last 32 years catastrophically misunderstanding who I actually am." 20 minutes later, Julian's security detail had arrived, followed closely by 2 Charleston PD officers taking Amara's statement, followed closely by Julian himself, arriving so fast he must have broken several traffic laws to get there, striding across the sidewalk and pulling Amara into his arms without asking, without hesitating, and for the first time in 10 years, Amara didn't pull away. "I've got you," he murmured into her hair, his own hands shaking as badly as hers. "I've got you both. I swear to God, Amara, I am ending this. Tonight." Over his shoulder, Amara caught sight of her own reflection in the shop's darkened front window, herself held tight in Julian Ashford's arms. 10 years of carefully maintained distance finally, completely collapsed, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her almost as much as the threat itself had, that whatever walls she'd built to protect her heart from this man were no longer entirely intact. She didn't have time to examine that feeling further, because across town, in a modest brick house on the edge of the historic district, a very different phone call was already in progress, one between Reginald Ashford and the man who'd approached Amara outside her shop, and the words being exchanged made it very clear that tonight's threat had been nothing more than the opening move in a plan far larger and far more dangerous than anyone yet realized. Reginald Ashford's phone call that night lasted 4 minutes, and it would later become the single most consequential 4 minutes of his professional life, because unbeknownst to him, his own attorney, sitting 3 blocks away in his downtown office with the board's independent investigator on a separate line, had flagged the man Reginald was calling weeks earlier after the very first unauthorized settlement draft crossed his desk. "It's done," the man said without preamble. "She got the message. Whether she acts on it is her business. Make sure she understands it wasn't a one-time conversation," Reginald said. "I want, Mr. Ashford." A new voice cut in, calm and clipped. "This is Special Agent Renata Osei, FBI. This call is being recorded as part of an ongoing investigation into witness intimidation and extortion connected to Ashford Global's legal department. I'd advise you not to say anything further without counsel present." The line went dead on Reginald's end almost immediately, but it didn't matter. Enough had already been captured. enough to corroborate the paper trail his own attorney had spent 2 weeks quietly assembling. Emails authorizing the settlement offer, wire transfers to a private security contractor with a documented history of consulting for exactly this kind of pressure campaign, and now an actual recorded reference to a man being sent to intimidate Amara outside her own shop. By the time Julian's phone rang again that night, this time from the board's legal counsel rather than from Amara, the tone of the entire crisis had shifted completely. "Julian, I need you to sit down," the counsel said. "We have enough right now to refer this to federal authorities. Witness intimidation, potential extortion, misuse of corporate funds to finance it. Your father isn't just looking at removal from the board anymore. He's looking at criminal charges." Julian, still sitting in Amara's living room with her curled beside him on the couch, Zion long asleep upstairs under the watchful eye of Odessa and 2 of the security detail Julian had insisted on stationing outside, closed his eyes and let out a long, unsteady breath. "Do it," he said. "Whatever the process is, I'm not protecting him from this. Not after tonight." He hung up and looked over at Amara, who had gone very still beside him, watching his face carefully. "It's over," he told her quietly. "Not just the board suspension. Actual federal investigators are involved now. He crossed a line tonight that even his lawyers can't spin away." Amara let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 2 weeks straight, maybe, some exhausted part of her acknowledged, for 10 years. "What happens now? Now?" Julian reached over, carefully, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she didn't, took her hand in his. "Now we let the investigation run its course. Renata handles the press narrative, on our terms like we discussed, and you and Zion get your lives back, and you?" Julian was quiet for a moment, looking down at their joined hands like he still couldn't quite believe he was allowed to hold it. "I don't know yet what my life looks like without my father controlling the board," he admitted. "I've spent 10 years building a version of myself that was designed to please him, or at least to survive him. I think I'm going to have to figure out who I am without that." "That sounds lonely," Amara said softly. "It would be," Julian agreed, "if I were doing it alone." He didn't push further than that, didn't ask for more than she'd already, cautiously, been willing to give him over the past 2 weeks, and Amara found herself grateful for the restraint, even as some quiet, long-buried part of her wished, just slightly, that he had. The federal investigation into Reginald Ashford moved with unusual speed, aided considerably by his own attorney's cooperation and the recorded call that Agent Osie's team had captured. Within 6 weeks, Reginald had resigned from every remaining position at Ashford Global, entered a plea agreement on lesser charges in exchange for full cooperation, and retreated to the Hilton Head estate to live out what Julian, when asked by a reporter, described only as the consequences of the choices he made. The board, in a unanimous vote, confirmed Julian as permanent CEO with full operational authority, no longer subject to his father's shadow influence, no longer negotiating his own family's approval in every boardroom decision. Whitfield and Bloom's health citation was quietly reversed once the inspector's original anonymous complaint was traced back to a burner phone linked to Reginald's security contractor. The bank restored their credit line with an apology and, Denise noted with some satisfaction, a fruit basket. The wholesale flour contract was never actually terminated. The supplier, it turned out, had simply been approached with a similar warning and had gotten cold feet before ever following through. And Zion, blessedly, unforgettably, never learned the full extent of what had almost happened to his family in those 2 terrifying weeks. He knew only that his grandfather, a man he'd never met, and, Amara decided firmly, never would, had done something bad enough to lose his job, and that his father had chosen, without hesitation, to stand against him. "That's what dads are supposed to do, right?" Zion had asked one evening, several weeks later, as Julian helped him with a science fair project on solar energy at the kitchen table. A fixture in their home now, 3 evenings a week, exactly as much as Amara had cautiously, incrementally allowed. Protect their family, even if it means losing something big. Julian had looked up at that, meeting Amara's eyes across the kitchen where she stood pretending to be absorbed in dinner preparations, and something passed between them that neither of them tried to name out loud. "Yeah, buddy," Julian said, voice a little rough. "That's exactly what dads are supposed to do." It was late October, the Charleston air finally cooling into something crisp and golden, when Julian showed up at the shop one evening after closing. No security detail this time, no board crisis trailing behind him, just a man in a simple jacket holding a single white peony, the same flower that had been in the vase on the counter the very first day he'd walked back into her life. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said before Amara could speak. "I know we're still figuring this out. I know 10 years doesn't undo itself just because I finally showed up and did the right thing when it mattered. But I wanted you to know, whatever this is, whatever we end up being to each other, I'm not going anywhere. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation to Zion, Because I choose to be here, every single day for as long as you'll let me." Amara looked at him for a long moment. This man who had broken her heart at 19 and spent 10 years letting that break calcify into something she'd told herself was healed over. This man who had, in the span of 2 months, torn down his own father's empire rather than let history repeat itself. She didn't know if she loved him. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time still. Trust, she'd learned the hard way, wasn't rebuilt in a single dramatic season. It was rebuilt in 1,000 small, unremarkable Tuesdays, in homework help and school pickups and promises kept quietly, without an audience over years. But she took the peony from his hand, and for the first time in 10 years, she let herself imagine a future that included him in it. "One day at a time," she said. "That's all I can promise you, Julian. One day at a time," he agreed, "is more than I ever thought I'd earn back." Outside, the Charleston evening settled gold and quiet over the harbor, and somewhere upstairs in her small house across town, a 9-year-old boy sat at his desk, finishing a science project about the physics of light, unaware that the two people who loved him most had just taken the first real, careful step toward finally becoming a family. Thank you, Proudly family, for joining us on this unforgettable journey. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, subscribe to Proudly Black Stories, and don't forget to tell us which country are you watching from, and what time is it in your city. We'll see you in the next inspiring story.